Welcome back to the Inclusive Activism Podcast. I am always as your host, Rowdy, and today we are going to be talking about an interesting topic. It's one of those things that's really got me thinking. I was online and I saw someone share online. They said, if I have white privilege, then someone needs to let my bank account know. And I was like, you don't really understand white privilege. And then I was like, but I can maybe see why you have a hard time understanding white privilege. So let's do a podcast about helping folks understand why they do have white privilege, and then also help them understand why it's hard to see if you're poor. Because especially if you're poor or you have other intersections, it's hard to see and notice that stuff because you don't feel like you're getting what every other white person's getting out of like white privilege because you're not having the same experience as them. The second part of the podcast is I'm going to look at how these intersections of oppression that people don't really examine, especially white people, because white people aren't used to thinking about being oppressed. They do kind of see classism to a degree, but still, there's not like a huge conversation about this in day-to-day society, and so it causes problems when people are trying to see intersectionally privilege and how privilege works. And we're going to talk about how racism and how racist practices is actually killing white people, and why white people need to be on board with abolishing racism and stopping racism just as much as anybody else. Because studies show that anti-racist policies help poor white people the most out of anybody. So okay, let's start unpacking white privilege. Alright, so white privilege is only about race. It's not about sexual orientation, it's not about social class, it's not about economic class, it's not about ability, it's not about anything other than things that deal with race only. When we're talking about white privilege, we're only talking about race specifically. So I'm going to give you examples of race-based white privilege examples, all right? So white people are usually not targeted by police because they're white, right? They might see that you're in an old car and pull over the old car, but they're never like, white guy, I don't know. What's that white guy doing in this neighborhood, right? Like, white people don't even get pulled over in neighborhoods that aren't their own, right? Because you would think, well, what's this white guy doing in this, like, Latino neighborhood, right? But still, they don't get pulled over because, like, white is just kind of seen as normal, right? Another thing is, no one ever looks at a group of white people and be like, what are those white people up to, right? Like, no one's ever like, why are all the white people sitting together at the cafeteria? Or how come there's so many white people at Luby's cafeteria? I don't think Luby's even exists anymore, but it's an example, right? No one sees whiteness as different. They just are like, whoa. But when they see like other people, they're like, whoa, look at all those black kids sitting together. What's going on? Whiteness is not seen in the same way as like blackness is. So no one's like, what are those group of white people up to? No, people don't do that stuff, right? But if it's black people, if it's Latino people, if it's Native people, they're like, whoa, that's weird that all those people are together and there's no white people in there. What's up, right? That's an example of white privilege, is no one sees you in a group based on your race and is like, what's up? I'm not, like, I'm concerned. What's the problem? What's the issue, right? When you're in school, and if you're a white person, school focuses on your history, right? It talks about the founding fathers. It talks about like the colonization from Europe. Like, it talks about all the white people, but it doesn't talk about like black history a lot. Like, I mean, outside of like Black History Month. And again, that's usually a poster that they roll out every year, blow the dust off of, and then tell you about George Washington Carver, and then we pack that stuff up, and that's it for black history, right? Not the same for white history, right? We learn more about Abraham Lincoln. We learn about like Alexander Hamilton. We learn about Benjamin Franklin. We learn about all these people, but we don't like learn about the same folks, right? Philosophers. We always learn about Greek people, but we never hear about like philosophers from Eastern like areas, like Lao Tzu and Taoism. Like, those are philosophers too, but we don't hear from those folks because, again, like white privilege kind of makes it so we just focus on white people and undervalue non-white people and non-white ways of thinking and seeing things. Books, movies, TV shows overwhelmingly have white people, right? So if you think about all the Avengers, like, who are the non-white Avengers? You got Black Panther, and everybody Black Panther knows. That's it. Let's see. That's about it. Thor's white, Captain America's white, Iron Man's white, Black Widow's white. Like, you see how like mostly white people, right? Like, you're overwhelmingly represented on movie, TV shows, books, everything, right? Like, even if there is somebody, like, they're noted, their difference makes them stand out. So, like in the horror movie, right? If there's a black guy, well, you know that dude's dead first, because there's usually not a black guy even in horror movies. Watch a lot of old horror movies. Like, one of the very, very few that has a lead black actor is Night of the Living Dead, and that was revolutionary. You should check it out. It was cool. But even in there, messing with like race stuff with that stuff. Another thing that you can do is you see like most CEOs, most people that run companies, and most people that are in government, mostly white people, right? So again, like, you're like, well, how does that benefit me specifically? Well, usually they're thinking from a white standpoint and not from like a Latino standpoint or from a Mexican standpoint or a Native American standpoint. They're thinking white first, right? White people overall, like, just like when you look at race, right? Just race stuff. White people get better interest rates and they get better credit scores than people from other races, right? Like, we don't know what it is. It's just the background. Like, it's just white people, no matter what, always higher. If like there's two people at the same socioeconomic level, white guy gets more better interest rate, better credit score than brown guy does. That's just the deal. You didn't do it. It's just the truth. Like, I'm not blaming you. You don't have to feel guilty for it. Like, because you didn't choose it. It's just something that came with the deal, but you still get it, right? White people can carry guns, like, basically anywhere without any issue. I saw somebody walking into a Subway with a rocket launcher, and I'm just like, how is that even practical? You're about to get a sub sandwich, and you have, like, like a rocket launcher on your back, and who are you going to shoot with that? And, like, even if you're in a hand-to-hand fight, this seems incredibly... It's not going to help. I don't know. It's strange. I don't know what's going on there. You can carry tons of cash, and no one's going to be like, what's up with all that cash? Like, if you're a black guy and you got like $10,000 cash in your pocket, people are going to be like, what's up? If you're a white guy with $10,000 cash pocket, you're like, that's a lot of money. But you're not like, white guy with a lot of cash, something's off, right? Like, we're not going to have race-based suspicion just because they have a whole bunch of cash in their pocket. Let's see. Band-Aids are your color, right? All Band-Aids are flesh tone for white people. Like, if there's not like black people Band-Aids, and if there are, they're way more expensive. And hair care products are basically built for everybody that's not black. Like, if you try to find black people hair care products, like, sometimes it's under lock and key, just to get your shampoo. And then it's only like, there's only like a section like this big, like in the store, depending on where you live, right? But again, it's an example of white privilege, right? Hair care products are made for you. You can talk to the manager, and the manager's probably going to be white if you're white. Makes sense, right? Like, just because like white people overrepresented in positions of power. Did you choose that? No. But is it a benefit you get? Yes. No one asks you to speak for your race. No one's like, well, what's the white perspective on this? Nobody really asks that question of you as an individual, right? So for me, like, people will be like, well, what do Native Americans think? And I'm like, man, there's 500 nations. I don't know. And I only have my experience to speak on. Like, the same thing doesn't happen for white people, right? Usually people don't stereotype all white men, because even though mass shooters tend to be white guys, right? There's not that association of like, like one lone white guy with a gun, they're probably going to shoot the place up, right? Whereas some people will see a black guy in a store and they're like, he might be a criminal, right? There's not the same association with that stuff. Like, people see white people armed all over the place, and even though most of the people that have done mass shootings have been white men with guns, like, people aren't like, oh, dude, that's it. Like, it's on, right? They don't make those same assumptions. And I'm going to tell you this one's going to sting. This one's going to suck, especially if you think you're a good person, right? You can claim, a white privilege thing you get is you can claim to be colorblind and then have no responsibility whatsoever for racism. Right? Like, we don't want to claim to be colorblind, right? Like, it's funny because people will be like, I don't see color. I treat everybody the same. And I go, how do you know? And then they go, well, I got a black friend. And I'm like, how do you know he's black? Right? Like, you do, obviously. Otherwise, you wouldn't be aware of that thing. And just because you claim to think race doesn't do anything for you, you still have white privilege because of this list of things. And I know you didn't choose it, but you get this unfairly, and other people don't get this, and life is harder for them because you just get these things, right? But I'm going to show you how whiteness, the practice of keeping white people on top of the social hierarchy, is problematic, especially for white people, okay? So if you're a white person, you're probably going to have a hard time seeing your race-based privilege because it assumes things about you, right? When people think of a white person, they assume certain things about the white person. And if you're not that thing, they're assuming you're not enough. You're not white enough to really count or really consider. Like there's some flaw with you, or there's some mistake, or you're doing something wrong, right? So white people assume, so if you're white and you're not this thing, you're not considered in whiteness, right? So if you, it assumes, if you're a white person, basically whiteness assumes you only work one job. If you work more than one job or several jobs, people go, well, what's wrong with you? Or you're not doing it right, kind of, right? This is an assumption. I think, average whiteness assumes that you're middle class, right? I heard an amazing statistic the other day. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, I'm not sure what the thing stands for, right? But it only takes into account people that are middle class when they're trying to help out with problems. What? What if you're below middle class? And there's a hurricane coming. Are you not equipped to deal with me and my needs? Whoa, that's terrible. And there's white people that aren't middle class, right? And they're just well, you're not in the plan, buddy. You see how this assumption of what white people are supposed to be doesn't take into account parts of people who actually exist in the world, right? There's white people with more than one job. There's white people that are not middle class, right? It also assumes that you've been in the United States for several years and you're American, right? They assume that you ethnically identify with only your Americanness. And if you celebrate your ethnic identities, they think you're weird, right? So if you're Irish and you're eating corned beef and soda bread, people are what's up? That's weird, right? Or if you're Italian and you're eating nothing but pasta and stuff all the time, right? Or if you're Czechoslovakian, right? And then you're eating your culture's food. People are that food stinks. What's wrong with you? Where's your hot dog? Where's your apple pie? Where's your hamburger? Right? They treat you as though you're not white because you're not doing what are generally thought of as white things, right? They assume, if you're a white person, they assume you own your own home. People assume all white people have their own homes. If you don't own your own home, if you rent your home, if you have a trailer, you're not considered in this whole thing, right? They're not seeing you unless you have that thing. That assumes you don't have a criminal history, right? Because people with a criminal history have to deal with other stuff. Also, it doesn't assume your veteran status, right? Because we don't exactly treat veterans great when they're done with their service. We're oh, sit down in the seat, but we don't help them with their healthcare issues with the VA, or we don't make sure that they get their benefits forever, or we don't hire them at a higher rate after their service, right? They struggle just more than actually other people. It assumes that you're either male or female and not transgender or genderqueer or intersex, right? If you're white, they only, when you think of white person, you think of white guy or white lady. You don't tend to think of trans white person. You don't think of intersex white person. You don't usually think of genderqueer white person, right? And this is how they don't see you. And because they don't see you, you're getting left out of what is the assumed white experience. They assume you're educated, right? Everybody assumes white people have gone to college and have a good and steady job, right? They don't really see white people that work in meat factories. People don't really see white folks that drive trucks. They don't really see them in their experience and what's going on with them, right? Because they don't consider them because they're not doing what white people are supposed to do, right? So this is why it's hard to see your privilege, because people are kind of punishing you for not being the way they expect you to be. They assume you had a quality education in a K through 12 setting, right? It doesn't really account for rural school districts and how some of those are closed or underfunded, right? It doesn't see how there's systemic inequities in education through the K through 12 system if you're in different spaces, right? If you're out in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, people aren't really considered or worried about you and your issues, right? This is where it's hard to really see that your white privilege, your racial privilege, because people aren't considering you with other parts of your oppressed identities. It assumes you have a really good paying job and that you only need the one job. Like, everybody assumes white people have that thing, and that's not necessarily true. White people have really crappy jobs and really have low paying jobs. They assume stuff about you that isn't you. And then it's funny because they always kind of leave you out of the conversation if you have any of these things and you're a white person, right? And this is because whiteness, like the practice of being like white, it doesn't usually look at intersectionality. Intersectionality is like other parts of you that might be white at the same time, right? So we really don't see poor white people, and we don't really reach out to them with their issues and their problems, right? And when poor white people have problems, we're like, well, that's their fault. They should work harder. They should get another job. They should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? We don't see them in the same way. If you're a white person and you live in a rural area, you're not seen. You're not reached out to. You're not included. And I would even say the Republican Party doesn't include rural white folks. They go out there and they play God Bless America, and they play I'm proud to be an American. But, like, how are they helping you with your internet problems? How are they helping you with, like, food bank stuff? Like, they're not helping you with stuff. People don't see that white people need guns to hunt for food, because that's part of being poor, right? That's not seen, that's not considered, right? You see how, like, you're not really seen if you're not the things they expect you to be? You're not really seen as a white person if you're an immigrant, right? If you practice your ethnic heritage from another country outside of the United States, you're not really accepted as a white person. You're not embraced within greater white society, right? If you don't speak English or you speak another language, again, you're like, what? What's this other language? What's going on here? And again, you're not seen if you're gay really in the same way if you're a white person, right? And this is how you can tell that systematically, like, people that are outside the box of expectation are punished for not being white right. All right? So this is how they show you in society you're not doing white right if they call you any of these names, because there's no stereotype or slur for third generation American who is upper middle class, who, like, there's no slur for a male upper class man who makes good money and only has one job. What's the slur, right? Like, it's funny, we have a slur for women that do that, right? We call her Karen. It's funny, and I think it's more socially acceptable to call her Karen because she's a woman, right? And it's because that woman identity, we can beat on her. That's not cool. Like, not the same thing for a man in the same situation. But again, if you are white and not rich, not urban, not American, we call you these things in society to show you you're practicing your whiteness wrong. So we will call you redneck. Redneck comes from somebody that works outside all day long, and so their neck gets sunburnt because they can have a hat, right? But their neck gets burnt because they're doing hard labor, right? Redneck assumes you're not white enough, or you're doing things wrong. You don't have a job in a cubicle somewhere. You don't have a job as a manager somewhere, right? Like, it shows you you're doing white wrong by calling you redneck and assuming you're not being white, because if you were doing white right, there would be no name to call you. What else? What other names do they have for people that do white wrong? White trash, right? If you're poor, if you're running around without a shirt, if you got cars broken down in your front yard, you're not seen as doing whiteness right, again. And so, again, it's hard to see your white privilege when, like, people are making fun of you for being a white trash all the time, right? White people and non-white people are calling you white trash. So how do you see your white racial privilege when there's a refrigerator in your front yard because, like, you can't afford to buy another one? They'll call you hillbilly if you live in the middle of nowhere. They'll call you trailer trash. Again, because they're punishing you because you're not more successful socioeconomically, right? Because there's an expectation that if you're white, you meet these standards. If you're not meeting these standards, you suck. Let's call you names, right? They'll call you a hick. They'll call you a hick, a backwoods hick. They'll call you backwoods. Again, it's because you're rural, right? Because you're not in an urban space. You're not meeting whiteness standards in the right way, so we're going to punish you. We're going to call you names. We're going to treat you badly because you're not performing your whiteness right. This is how racism works. It even works against white people because it assumes all these other standards that don't include all white people. They'll call you good old boy. They'll call you honky. Did you know honky comes from a word that meant like Hungarian laborer, right? Again, you see the immigrant intersection, right? White but immigrant, so honky, let's push them down, let's oppress them, right? They'll call you Euro trash. They'll call you country bumpkin. They call you all types of names if you're not a rich, well-educated, one job having, middle class to upper middle class person that is white. Like all these people that don't have those things that are white people, they're being oppressed, but not because they're white. It's because they're white and poor. They're being oppressed because they're white and an immigrant. They're being oppressed because they're white and woman, right? They're being oppressed because they're white and gay, right? Because it's not meeting the standards of whiteness that we see represented in society, right? And so because of this, white people suffer because of racism, because really, truly, people don't do a great job at reaching out to like intersectionally oppressed white people to join in the fight for equity. And the only people that do reach out to intersectionally oppressed white people are Republicans, but the Republicans aren't really doing anything to help them, right? Like some people out there, like I go out here and I live in Arizona, I see Trump people all over the place. And like, I don't want to get in the conversation, but I am curious to be like, which Trump policies has made your life better? What Trump policy made it so you got a raise? What Trump policy made it easier for you to buy a home? What Trump policy made it easier for you to buy your new car? Right? And I'm not talking about your second home. I'm talking about your first home. I'm not talking about your second car. I'm talking about your first car. Right? I'm talking about like folks that are just getting by. What has Trump done to really help them? Not much. It makes them feel better because they're just not black people. Not like liberals. That's all he does is to make you feel better. And it's hard because the number one area of growth of suicide is in older white men. And I think it's because economically it's getting harder and harder for everybody out there. The middle class is getting shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And there's all these pressure and all these forces that are making it harder just to live a middle class lifestyle. And like white people that are intersectionally oppressed get crap from liberals, right, about their white privilege. And they're like, I don't really even feel like I have white privilege because I'm poor. Now you do get white privilege, right? Again, race-based privilege only, but you're also dealing with socioeconomic oppression because you're poor or because you're not middle class, right? And no one's reaching out to you and be like, hey, we got you. Hey, we're going to articulate for things that can help you too. Obamacare helps you and this other family that happens to be a family of color, right? But they're not seen, they're not embraced, and they're really not like loved by anybody on both sides. Like Republicans like come and slap them on the back and say like, yeah, you're a real American, and they feel good for that. And then liberals come in, you're too stupid to know the Republicans are taking advantage of you. And then like intersectionally oppressed white people just get left out. So because of that, people are like, well, like I'm working my butt off. I'm working 2 jobs and I can't make ends meet. So like white men are committing suicide, or they're getting addicted to opiates, or they'll have issues with alcoholism, and the rates are going through the roof, right? And the reason is because they don't understand that other parts of them are oppressed. They don't see that other parts of them are held down by society, and then they think, well, then the mistake is me. The mess up is me, right? So I might as well just kill myself so my kids can get my life insurance. I might as well just kill myself because I'm not helping anybody. I might as well just kill myself because nobody cares about me or really reaches out to me, right? And this is how systemic racism still hurts white people too, because it assumes that you got all the other thing that you see in white society, right? Like white society does not see you unless you're middle class or above, unless you're heterosexual, unless you're working only one job, unless you live in an urban space or at least the suburbs, right? Like it assumes all these things that some white people just aren't. And like people in diversity areas need to reach out to these poor oppressed white people, and poor oppressed white people need to reach out to minorities because we understand what this feels like, right? We can be like, dude, it's not your fault. The system's built against you because you're poor. The system's built against you because you're gay. The system's built against you because you're that assumes that you only need one job and you can pay your rent. Like, if minimum wage can't pay for an apartment where you live, the system's broken. Because no one should need to be on food stamps or welfare if they're working a full-time job. But we have a story that says if you're working a full-time job and you don't have a house and you're not making your ends meet, then there's something wrong with you. And you should suffer more so you'll want to improve so you can have those things. That's ridiculous. Anybody that works a full-time job should be able to pay their bills and be happy. I mean, just have a shot at happiness, right? But the schism keeps us apart. And again, I'm not saying white privilege doesn't exist. It does. I told you examples of these other things, right? And so you have to understand you get this stuff. But we're not saying you're the root of all evil either. We need to talk to white people about their experiences being oppressed, or what it's like to live in rural spaces, and like how like black folks and white folks can get together, or Latino folks and Native folks can get together with poor white people to really come together to advocate for change together, and not just for white people. Because like what happens is sometimes people throw poor white people a bone every now and again. And because they get that bone every now and again, that's enough to keep us apart, keep us fighting each other, keep us thinking that we're not on the same team with the same issues, with the same worries, right? We need to see and recognize this stuff because white people are dying, and they're dying because of racism. Because racism assumes they have all they need. And if you don't have all you need, then we just punish, right? Conservatives and liberals punish white people. Like, society punishes white people that have oppressed identities. And we need to be able to reach out and reach beyond this stuff. So today, what did we talk about? Today we talked about white privilege, and that white racial privilege exists no matter what other oppressed identities you have. It does, but it doesn't mean you're rich too. White privilege does not mean you're rich. White privilege does not mean that you're heterosexual. White privilege does not mean that you're mentally that you have no mental health issues. White privilege does not mean that you don't have any physical ability issues. White privilege does not mean you don't have learning disabilities. You have all these things, but it's just not worse because you're not another race. That's the difference, right? And so we need to get better at articulating this idea, because we're leaving white people out because we don't understand intersectionally. They're not feeling the privilege in the same way. Like, your privilege is invisible to you until somebody shows you what you're missing, right? Like, I didn't understand male privilege until women told me about it. And then when women told me, like, yeah, you're right, I don't have to worry about walking in dark parking lots. Or, yeah, you're right, I can give my phone number to whoever. And the worst thing I got to do was worry about blocking that number. Like, it's only in conversations with people that are different that we see other things. But intersectionally, we're missing parts of them and the parts of their experience because we're not having conversations with them either, right? And this is the way to help us come back together. We talked about in the podcast that intersexual forms of oppression make it very hard to see and understand white privilege because you're so busy seeing your barriers from being poor, from being rural, from being like having to work several jobs. You can't slow down enough to see your white racial privilege. And then we talked about how if you're not doing whiteness right, we're going to punish you with like country bumpkin, with hick, with white trash, with trailer trash, with Euro trash. We're going to like make fun of folks who intersectionally have issues that are not associated with traditional forms of whiteness as they are represented. So with that, that's all I've got for you today. So if you thought this podcast was interesting or helpful, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, whatever. Drop a line and be like, wow, that was interesting. I listened to Rowdy, the inclusive activist, talk a little bit more about why it's harder for poor white people to see their white privilege. And I really came away with a better understanding of the difficulty and how hard that is. I also learned how I could better reach out and create alliances with white people and people of color, or other people from oppressed identities, to advocate for one another, to help create situations of equity for all people, right? We were able to see those stuff, right? So let me know. And then if you heard something that really made a difference, you can drop me a comment. If you're seeing this posted on Facebook, or if you're seeing this on YouTube, drop me a comment, tell me your thoughts, tell me your opinions. You can email me at inclusiveactivism@cox.net. That's inclusiveactivism@cox.net. And share the podcast. Let people know you're learning. Use this learning in another space. Have a conversation with somebody different than you. And hopefully we can come to a better understanding together. Because the truth of the matter is, it is ridiculously hard out there. And unless we're here for one another, co-advocating for one another, talking to people that are different than us, we're going to feel isolated, alone, and then we're going to be at risk of suicide, or becoming alcoholic, or dependent on drugs, because we're not going to feel like anybody's got our back. Together, we're better. But alone, it's tough. And some people out there are feeling pretty alone. And it's not because they chose to. And some people lied to some folks. But nobody's being compassionate and reaching out. If I'm a rural, poor, white person, and everybody keeps calling me a dumbass because I'm not embracing liberal policies, I'm not going to feel incredibly welcomed by you either. If I'm always yelled at, always put down, no one's going to ever create a space of new understanding. And that's what we need, an opportunity, something new, something different, and understand things and systems in more holistic ways. So with that, that's all I got for you today. I hope this really resonated. You can learn more about me at Inclusive Activism at www.inclusiveactivism.com, or you can email me at inclusiveactivism@cox.net. And this has been Rowdy the Inclusive Activist, and I appreciate your time, thought, and opinions. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.